As we start today, the person we're going to talk about, it might not be a person that anybody here really remembers this name or has heard of him before. Some of you have. His name's Jacobus Arminius. About 80 years have passed since the changes that started with Martin Luther. And while Martin Luther did some very good things we talked about last week, it also started a process that maybe went off in a direction that is not maybe the healthiest. After Luther came someone named John Calvin, and I'm sure you've learned about him. And after Calvin was a man named Beza, B-E-Z-A. And with each generation, parts of the Reformation became more stringent and maybe more lopsided. And let me remind everyone of one thing, that if you lived in 1600, life was tough. I remember I can't remember where we were. It was a museum, and it showed a bed from around the 1600s, 1700s. And the bed was only about 4 feet long. And we asked someone why it was so short, and they said, well, in those days, most people kind of slept sitting up because a lot of people just ran constant low-level sinus infections, and it was hard for them to lay down. We forget what life might have been like before, some of the things we take for granted, like penicillin and some of the other things. And life was tough. You never knew when the cholera epidemic or the smallpox epidemic would come sweeping in over the hills and really take out a lot of your town. It was really tough. You worked all the time. Most people were servants or simple laborers, and maybe you were a serf that farmed the land for the rich lord in your area, and that was your life. He lived in the castle. You lived in the sod hut. And if you had a good year, he came for your taxes anyway, even though he had the castle. You worked, you lived, you ate on their terms. And you struggled to eat. All the decisions of your life were made by someone else. Even the early parts of the Industrial Revolution, you would get the job, but you had to shop in the company store and live in company housing. And it was the level of control that people had over your life was great. Into this world walked John Calvin. Calvin said a few things. He stated that, well, God had already chosen a select few for salvation. And if you weren't part of that few, well, you're out of luck. And that was the dominant viewpoint. It was a bleak world. But if you live in a time when every decision is made for you, this isn't a big jump. And you would think, wow, I hope I'm one of the elect. And you'd start going to church and you go, yes, I am one of the elect. Good. I'm not one of these other ones. Then Beza came in and said something even a little further. He said this. He said, God purposefully created a world full of sin. He wanted humanity to sin just so it could get so bad he could find a small group to save that small group out of that bleak picture. So he not only selected a few people to have a relationship with God, but he purposefully banished the majority of people just so there's a group of people that he could pull them out of. You say, Pastor, that's twisted. I agree with you. 100%. So God actively chose those he wished to save, and he also selected those for destruction. And that was the dominant picture. And into this world strove this man that I want to introduce you today named Jacobus Arminius. It is a name we know a little bit, but very few people know his story. Let me just tell you one thing. Back a number of years ago, I wrote a 25-page paper on Arminius. And I thought, Oh, okay, that's great. I'll never use this paper again as long as I live. Wrong. And I finally got to pull it out. And a number of years, there was a if you're ever going to do a study on Arminius, there was a guy who wrote the book about him named Carl Bangs. I don't know if that name means anything to anybody. But this Carl Bangs became a professor, and years later, one of his students, when he was older, was a guy named John Cotner, who I met in Marshall, Texas, and became a friend of mine. And John Cotner, at the very end of his life, gave me the dissertation, because Carl Bangs gave his dissertation to John Cotner and all the notes. And John Cotner gave me that dissertation and all the notes. Now, years ago, I gave it to an archives for people who might want to study. And so I gave that to an archive years ago. But I find that interesting that for a little bit of time, it passed through my hands. And I'm talking about a guy named Arminius right now. I want to read Joshua 24, and it will flow into what we're talking about today. This is Joshua looking at Israel, and he says, if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve. Whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Then the people answered, far be it from us to forsake the Lord to serve other gods. Here's why Arminius should be in the Hall of Fame. He said some very important things. First thing he said is we are created in God's image, every last one of us. That doesn't mean we look like God. We have the physical representation of God. I don't think that's at all. We're created in God's image. We have the capacity to know and to choose good and evil. The very first story in Genesis is about the fall of man. And you read any children's storybook, it all talks about there's this one tree in the middle of the garden, and God put this like barrier around the tree and said you must not eat of it. But if you read Genesis, there's not one tree in the middle of the garden, there's two. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of eternal life. And both of them represent ways that we can choose to be like God. One is eternal life. The other one is we can choose to know evil as well as good. And God says, yeah, both of them are there. Don't do the second one. You don't want to know evil. You don't want to have personal interaction with it because it will end up killing you. And we, the first in the story, Adam and Eve did what we do. Who are you to tell me which tree to eat? If I want to know evil as well as good, I will know evil as well as good. I choose it for myself. We have a choice. And since that time, we are flawed. We're flawed for a lot of different reasons. We're flawed because, we're born with maybe a weakness, a proclivity, an inherent something that we have to overcome. And I also think we overcome all the accumulated weight of everything that comes before us. And it's not all fair. There are people in here who had wonderful parents and wonderful grandparents. And while they might have had a thing, I speak very highly often of my grandmother, who was a wonderful woman in every way, shape, or form. Godliest woman that I've ever known. Has every admirable trait you would ever want, except every weekday at 1:30, she had to watch As the World Turns. Excuse me, I have to watch my program. And I laugh. You've seen the commercials now where people are being taught by the person how not to be old. And one of them says, it's not a program, it's a TV show. It makes me laugh because my grandma, I have to go watch my program. And maybe we don't have to overcome a lot. Other people, you grew up in maybe your parents were selfish. Maybe you have a long line of people who made a mess of things. And you have the accumulated weight of all that. I was down at Olivet on Thursday, and Thursday was the day where it's freshman orientation. And I know that there's freshmen that are going to hit the ground running. They already got their program. They already got their calendars fired up. They already know here and there, and they already got their study times, and they're diligent about it. And then I know there's other freshmen going to hit the ground going, what's a study time? And because we don't all start off on even terms. I was talking to someone on Thursday, and I said, now it's highly important. Listen, you need to go to class, and right when you get out of class, get your work done, and then you'll have plenty of free time. Know where you're going to go for study. Be sure you're diligent about those times, and you'll be a success. And he looked at me and said, is that what you did? And I said, let's not talk about me. Here's what you're going to do. You can't expect me to go study when there's a pickup basketball game going in the gym. That was my college whole career. Arminius then said this. He said, listen, God's grace, here's how it works. God's grace flows to everyone, and what it does is God's grace enables our free will to recognize grace and respond. Because the people in his time said this, you are so depraved, you can't even respond to God's grace. You can't hear it, you can't say yes, you can't say respond to it, you can't follow Christ. You need to be one of those few because you are so unable to do it. God has to make your entire life in order for you to do that. Arminius said, wait a minute, hang on. No, you retain enough of the image of God, and God's grace activates your will where you can respond to good. Arminius said everything that's good flows from God, and we are never the source of that grace. We don't activate the good. We don't have things figured out. We don't follow our good smarts to advance much. And then he said this. He says, look at a beggar. A beggar receives something. They are not the source of the free gift that they get. But even this was what Arminius said. But even a beggar has to reach out their hand to receive the gift. A beggar can choose to keep their hand closed, turn their back. He said, we don't have anything. We don't bring anything to the table, but even a beggar receives. He kept talking about our ability, our free will. We not only have free will activated where we can willingly choose to follow Christ, but that free will remains even after faith. We can choose to say yes, and after faith, we can choose to say no. If we are created in the image of God, then that image remains even after faith. We keep the right to choose or reject through a lifetime. And I think that's important to remember, because even after we come to faith, there are times of life where new things enter, and we have to choose to do the right thing or do the wrong thing. Some of us chose to become Christian when we were 7 or 12 or 14, and we gave our lives to Christ. Can I tell you something? When I was 12, my life wasn't really complicated. So at 16 and 18 and 22 and 35 and 47 and 54, there are things in life that used to not be there. And I can choose to be obedient in the new things, or I can choose to look at God and say, no, I want to go my own way. But we still have God's image. We also, one of the things that he made a difference, we are able to choose. As I said before, there were prominent leaders. All the big leaders of that day said humanity was destined to sin. And not only that, you were made to sin. So it's not your fault. God needed you to do that so he could save some. God needs all of you to sin so he can pull 5 of you out of the fire. That's all part of the plan. Some of us are old enough to remember, and I'm on the edge, so I'm talking to a minority of people here. In the early 70s, there was a Flip Wilson show. And some of you remember Flip Wilson. Flip Wilson's number one skit that everybody waited on was when he got to say, "The devil made me do it." regardless of what it was. It was all these things would happen. Devil made me do it. His skit was, I don't have any responsibility. I'm not to blame. The devil made me do it. Well, Calvin and Basil was just a little different. God made me do it. So you have no responsibility. And if that's the case, then how on earth could we ever be held accountable for actions that God destined us to do? There's danger here. Arminius reminded us no, and he pulled out a verse from Ezekiel. The soul that sins is the soul that dies. We're responsible for our actions. God did not make me do it. The devil did not make me do it. I did it. Here's one of the main messages that I think should echo down through time that started with Arminius, and that's this one. I am responsible for me. And might I suggest that that is a message that is especially fresh again today? There's a point in life where I'm responsible for me. I know it's not all fair. I know that you didn't get the 12th birthday party that all the other kids in the neighborhood got, and you've never gotten over it. Maybe it's time to get over it. I know you grew up in the wrong end of town, and other people had more stuff than you did, and you've never gotten over it. And you've made spending decisions as an adult based on your experiences as a childhood, and you've never gotten over it. Maybe today, let me offer you a suggestion. Maybe today it's time to get over it. No, it's not all fair. But there's a time in life we have to come up square with this simple suggestion. I'm responsible for me. There's only so long I can blame mom, I can blame dad, I can blame grandma, grandpa, I can blame all the generations. I did it. And along with this, Arminius reminded us of something else. He said this, grace is resistible. I can tell God no. Truth be told, a lot of us tell God no. And each time we tell God no, guess what? It gets easier. That voice gets a little duller and a little dimmer, and it's harder to hear. I don't want that voice to get hard to hear. That's one reason we should get in the habit of saying yes. There's a lot of places in 2 Corinthians 6:1, Acts 7:51. Acts 7:51 says this, you stiff-necked people, why do you always resist the Holy Spirit? That's Paul looking at the situation saying, well, it's possible to resist. It's possible to tell God no. I think it is. In fact, I'm quoting from Arminius here when he said this. This is in response to other people. He said, it's possible for a Christian to grow lazy, to not be careful over their affairs, and to actively give place for sin to grow, so that little by little, we eventually become half dead. And after more time, eventually die altogether. See, that's the danger, I think. Little by little, giving place for sin to grow. Nothing starts. I'm never going to just, this afternoon at 3 o'clock, well, I want to rob a liquor store. That seems like a good idea. Or sitting around saying, TV show was just about a person having an affair. I think I'll have an affair by 3 o'clock. That's not how it starts. It's little by little. That person you share an easy laugh with, I know they go to the water cooler at 10 o'clock. Maybe I'll go to the water cooler at 10 o'clock. I'll be there when they're there. I like the conversation. Little by little, incrementally, over time. Oh, sure, affects other people. Doesn't affect me that way. little by little, over time. We have a love, we have a thing that we like more than God, and so that becomes, part of that thing that we plan for and do. So God does not cause you to sin. God is not responsible for your sin. God did not create evil just so that He can save you from it. He created a world, and He created beings by which could have a relationship with Him. And you cannot have a relationship with something that does not have choice. Let me say that again. You cannot have a relationship with something that does not have a choice in the matter. I use a knife and fork. I don't have a relationship with them. If I have a relationship with them, I need to talk to a professional. Arminius said one other thing, and this caused him to have great problems. He said, God does not act alone. Our obedience, our cooperation, our reaction is necessary for us to have a relationship with God. So in the end, he had this idea that yes, we are saved by faith. That was what we talked about last week. Let's talk about the next step. We're not saved simply by taking up oxygen. We're not saved because God decided to endow us with something and not other people, and we don't have any role in it. And yes, John Calvin at that time had something. He says you have, it's called, that grace is irresistible. And if you're part of the chosen, you can't resist. There's nothing you can do about it. You're just part of the elect. You're just become a pawn in a larger drama. I'll never forget my freshman year at Olivet. It was literally the second or third day. I can't remember who it was. But there was a young man, I think he only lasted the first semester. He walked up to a girl on the quad and said, I want you to know I've been praying. It's God's will for you to marry me. And the girl says, you need to pray some more. Because she rightly thought, wait a minute, buddy, I have a say in this. And my say is no. So salvation does come through faith by believing. Romans 4:3 says, Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. That's simple. God told Abraham, I have a plan for you. I need you to go. And Abraham said, yes. And God said, you're one of my people. That simple act of faith. He also said one other thing, and I'm going to stretch you a little bit here, because I think there's part of this. This requires a larger discussion, but I think he's right. When he said this, he said, look, you are not guilty of original sin. You have original sin, but you're not guilty of it. You're guilty when you act on it. You're guilty when you choose to go against God. Yes, we fight against it. Yes, it makes us weak. We have a thing that makes it hard to overcome, but you're not guilty of it. You're just born with it. You're guilty is when you choose to act in rebellion against God. And the people around him lost their mind. He preached this in a church, I think in 1604. He said, let me tell you something. And he looked at his people. You are born flawed and you're born corrupted. And there are things that you have to overcome in life. There are things we have to overcome. Some of you have a really, really short fuse. Short. Boom. Others of you have a long fuse. It's not the fuse that's the problem. It's the boom that's the problem. It's okay, everything's okay, kablooey. Some of you have to battle constant negativity. Some of you have to battle critical natures. Some of you have to battle worry. There's all something we have to overcome. And how well we battle ourselves will often define how strong we grow spiritually. We have a nature that's selfish, prideful, lustful, etc. We're guilty when we choose to do wrong. Finally, Arminius said one other thing. He said, babies are not guilty. Trust me, this got him into trouble. Babies are not guilty. Before then, people said, if a baby's born and before he got baptized, like it lived for 15 minutes and died, the baby's soul is lost. Liable for damnation. And Arminius said no. Because that baby hadn't done anything wrong, was not able to willfully choose. And they started a whole inquisition against him, wanted to remove him from his pulpit, remove him from teaching, because he said a baby that dies before baptism will not be lost forever. Arminius said no, because there's a grace that's there that enables us to respond, a grace that hears God's voice, a grace that enables us to choose grace. He called it, are you ready? It's one of my favorite words, prevenient grace that goes to all of us. And that's why he should be in the Hall of Fame. He reminded us of some very important things. And let me just shorten them up for you here. First, God's grace flows to every single person, including you. There's no one here that's outside the boundaries of God's grace. There's no one that's here that's outside of God's care. There's no one here that Jesus did not die for. Second thing he said is, it's possible for us to resist and tell God no, but that is a dangerous place to be. To be the person that's constantly telling God no. We are responsible for ourselves. Our dad's not at the fault. Our mom's not at fault. Our grandparents aren't at fault. The problem's me. But this is nothing new. This has been there forever. It reminded me of a text in Deuteronomy chapter 30. It says this. Now listen. I'll get to what's here eventually. Today I'm giving you a choice between life and death, between prosperity and disaster. For I command you this day to love the Lord your God and to keep His commands, decrees, and regulations by walking in His ways. And if you do this, you will live and multiply. And the Lord your God will bless you in the land you're about to enter and occupy. But if your heart turns away and you refuse to listen, and if you are drawn away to serve and worship other gods, then I warn you that you will certainly be destroyed. You will not live a long, good life in the land you are crossing the Jordan to occupy. And now, so this day I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life, so that you may love the Lord your God, listen to His voice, and hold fast to Him. For the Lord is your life, and He will give you many years in the land He swore to give to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's amazing how, after a while, we took this simple message and had gotten it to the point where there was only a select few that could respond to God's grace. One of the reasons why this is important today, this idea is, God is interested in you and loves you, to the point that He sent His Son to die on the cross and rise again.